When the old clocks of Rosendale Manor struck 3 in the dead of night, it wasn't just time that stopped. A heartbeat faltered, a breath ceased, a life was lost. The chandeliers still shimmered, but their glow fell upon a secret that should have remained buried forever. And when the first scream shattered the stillness of the grand estate, it became clear this was no ordinary murder. It was a mystery that defied reason, time, and logic. But the most chilling part? The victim had entered the locked room after the door was already sealed. The sun had barely begun to warm the winding lanes of Blackwood Hollow when Miss Eleanor Vane stepped into her overgrown garden, a pair of rusted shears in hand. The morning air was cool, laced with the scent of damp earth and the distant toll of the church bell. The roses, once vibrant, now bore the weight of neglect, their thorny stems twisting like secrets long buried. As she clipped away the dead blooms, neighbors passed with nods and polite smiles, too polite, too knowing. Mrs. Finchley, her basket brimming with eggs still warm from the nest, paused at the gate. "Lovely morning for the garden, isn't it?" she mused, though her eyes flickered toward the house beyond, as if expecting movement from the shadowed windows. "Indeed, Mrs. Finchley," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the quiet amusement of someone who knew that in Blackwood Hollow, even the most casual greeting often veiled deeper intentions. This village, with its cobbled streets and quaint cottages, wore its charm like a well-fitted mask, but beneath the surface whispers stirred. Her morning chore done, Eleanor wandered toward the grocer's, where the scent of fresh bread mingled with something less wholesome, a current of unease threading through the chatter. Mrs. Hargrove, the self-appointed keeper of the town's gossip, leaned across the counter, voice hushed. "Miss Vane, you won't believe what I've heard about Mr. Ashford." Her fingers pressed against the wooden surface as if to steady herself. "They say he's been receiving threats, letters with no return address, and last night, a stranger was seen loitering near his estate. No one recognized him." Eleanor's gaze flicked to the shop window, where beyond the glass, a figure rushed past. Beatrice Langley, Ashford's secretary, her usually composed face stark with unease, her steps hurried. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the handle of her basket. Distress, when seen in the young, was never to be ignored. It was often the first crack in the surface before something deeper emerged. At the post office, the scent of ink and parchment clung to the air. Mr. Pritchard, sorting through the morning mail, barely glanced up as he muttered, "Odd one for Ashford today, peculiar handwriting, almost theatrical." He turned the envelope, revealing a scrawled script that seemed almost performative, as if the letter itself were a carefully staged act in an unseen play. Eleanor studied it, her mind shifting through the implications. "Peculiar indeed," she murmured. "One wonders what such a letter might confess, if only paper could speak." The tension in the village was subtle yet undeniable, a tremor beneath the surface of daily life. As Eleanor stepped back onto the street, the rhythmic laughter of children in the square seemed almost discordant against the quiet hum of apprehension. The path home felt longer than usual, her thoughts tangled in the threads of something forming, something unseen yet inevitable. And there, looming at the edge of town, was Ashford Manor, its darkened windows watching like the hollowed eyes of a sentinel. Inside, the study was thick with the scent of aged mahogany and brandy, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the leather-bound volumes lining the walls. Henry Ashford sat at his desk, rifling through a stack of letters, each a whisper of warning, each a reminder that the past was never truly buried. His jaw tightened. "Old ghosts," he muttered under his breath. "They never rest." The door creaked open, and Beatrice stepped inside, her presence light yet trembling. She laid a fresh set of letters on the polished wood, her hands betraying a slight tremor. "Today's post, sir," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Ashford didn't look up. Anything else? The silence stretched, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of speech. But then, as if something unseen had stilled her tongue, She merely shook her head and turned away. But Eleanor Vane had spent her life reading between the lines of human nature, and she knew that in Blackwood Hollow, silence was often the loudest confession of all. The first light of dawn slithered through the narrow lanes of Blackthorn village, its golden fingers stretching toward the imposing Ashcroft Manor, a relic of grandeur that loomed over the town like a silent sentinel. Beneath its towering gables, the world still slumbered, except for Eleanor Graves. She stepped into her garden, shears in hand, her mind as sharp as the tools she wielded. The roses, much like the village itself, required careful tending, for beneath their beauty lurked thorns waiting to draw blood. As she snipped away dead blooms, familiar voices drifted over the hedge, Mrs. Caldwell, basket in hand, her usual gossip mingling with the scent of fresh bread from the nearby bakery. "Have you heard, Miss Graves?" she whispered, eyes gleaming with hushed excitement. "Lord Ashcroft has been receiving letters. Nasty ones, threats they say. And last night," she paused, glancing over her shoulder before lowering her voice, "a stranger was seen skulking near the manor gates." Eleanor, ever the silent observer, merely nodded, filing the information away. Secrets were the very fabric of Blackthorn, woven into its cobbled streets and ivy-clad walls. She bid Mrs. Caldwell farewell, and made her way to the grocer's, where the morning hum of villagers was punctuated by murmured speculations. Behind the counter, Mr. Fairchild, the postmaster, held up a peculiar envelope, its script erratic, its paper thick and yellowed with age. "For Lord Ashcroft," he muttered, eyes narrowing. "This one feels different." Eleanor studied it, her instincts stirring. The ink bled slightly into the parchment, as if written in haste, the seal smudged, a hand that trembled, or one that had seen too much. Before she could linger, a shadow flitted past the window. Isabel Hawthorne, Ashcroft's secretary, her face a canvas of unease, her hands clutching the strap of her bag with white-knuckled tension. The sight sent a ripple through Eleanor's thoughts. Fear wore many masks in Blackthorn, and this one had yet to be unmasked. As she turned onto the main road, her path led her to Ashcroft Manor, where the air carried a chill that had nothing to do with the season. Inside, in the depths of his study, Lord Ashcroft sat in the dim glow of his desk lamp, sifting through a pile of letters, his eyes sharp as a blade. The threats had begun subtly, veiled warnings, cryptic notes, but now they had escalated. He reached for his brandy, but his fingers trembled, betraying the iron composure he wore before the world. The clock on the mantel struck 9, and as if on cue, the door creaked open. Arthur Sterling stepped inside, his polished demeanor at odds with the shadow in his gaze. "We need to talk about security," he said, voice smooth but firm. "Especially your safe." Ashcroft's grip tightened on the key in his pocket. "What about it?" "Ensuring it's untampered with," Sterling replied, watching him too closely. Eleanor, had she been present, would have caught the flicker in Ashcroft's expression, the momentary hesitation that whispered of something deeper. But there was another presence in the room that went unnoticed, something unseen yet lurking just beneath the surface of pleasantries and polished words. As Sterling took his leave, he passed Isabel in the hallway. She stiffened at his presence, her lips pressing into a thin line. Sterling merely smiled, but his eyes lingered, as if memorizing the shape of her fear. Outside, the night descended in a suffocating hush, and the manor stood against the star-strewn sky, like a monolith of secrets waiting to be unearthed. The following morning, when the first rays of sunlight brushed against the ivy-clad walls, the stillness of the manor was shattered. Miss Collins, the housekeeper, approached the study with a breakfast tray, her steps light, her mind already occupied with the day's tasks. She knocked. No response. She knocked again, louder. Silence. A thread of unease coiled in her chest as she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The tray slipped from her grasp, crashing to the floor. Lord Ashcroft sat slumped over his desk, the brandy glass still in his hand, his face frozen in an expression of silent horror. The air was thick with the remnants of cigar smoke and something more insidious, something metallic. Blood pooled beneath the heavy oak desk, seeping into the rug like ink upon parchment. Outside, the village stirred to life, blissfully unaware that the shadows had finally spilled over. Blackthorn, for all its charm, had just awakened to a nightmare. The morning air in Ravenshade was thick with the scent of damp earth, and an eerie hush had settled over the village, as though the town itself held its breath, waiting. Blackthorn House, a hulking relic of a bygone era, stood solemnly against the grey sky, its towering spires and ivy-choked walls casting long ominous shadows across the lawn. Within its cavernous halls, something unnatural lingered, curling through the air like a whisper of unfinished business. In the dimly lit study, the scent of stale cigars clashed with something far more sinister, the acrid tang of death. Edward Blackthorn, the late Lord Blackthorn's nephew, stumbled back, his breath hitching, as his eyes fixed on the lifeless form slumped over the grand oak desk. Lord Reginald Blackthorn, the master of the house, was dead. His silver hair, always immaculately combed, was now dishevelled, his rigid fingers curled around a half-filled brandy glass. The deep amber liquid, undisturbed, sat untouched beside a scattering of papers and a brass letter opener. A single candle flickered, its weakened flame casting elongated shadows across the room, dancing like spectres against the dark wood panels. "God help us," Edward muttered, his voice strained, his expression frozen between shock and something else. Was it relief? Panic? Guilt? The heavy silence was broken by the creak of the door, as Mrs. Havisham, the housekeeper, entered, a silver tray balanced precariously in her hands. At the sight before her, her face turned ashen, the tray slipping from her grasp. Porcelain shattered against the floor, the sharp crash reverberating through the house like a gunshot. "No," she whispered, one trembling hand covering her mouth. "I'll fetch Dr. Willoughby." Her voice wavered, and before another word could be spoken, she rushed from the room, her hurried footsteps fading into the corridor. By the time the doctor arrived, the manor had become a hive of murmured voices and uncertain glances. Servants huddled in tight clusters, whispering behind gloved hands, while the upper floors remained heavy with an unnatural stillness. Outside, in the cobbled streets of Ravenshade, news of the Lord's passing spread like wildfire. At the bakery, Mrs. Holloway gasped, pressing a hand to her ample chest as she leaned across the counter. "Dead, you say?" she whispered to the widow across from her, her voice trembling with uncontained intrigue. In his study, locked inside, the widow, a woman with eyes sharper than her knitting needles, nodded grimly. "Just sat down for his nightly brandy, and never got up again." In the tea shop, where warmth and gossip were served in equal measure, Miss Eleanor Graves stirred her tea slowly, absorbing the words of Mrs. Ashworth with quiet intensity. "Poisoned," she mused, her brows knitting together, and no sign of a break-in. She took a measured sip, her mind already assembling the pieces of the puzzle. One locks a door to keep something out, but what if the danger was already within? It was an inconsistency that gnawed at her. Lord Blackthorn had been a man of strict routine, meticulous in every aspect of his life. If he had locked his study, it meant he had anticipated something, or someone. Yet there had been no struggle, no signs of a forced entry. Setting down her cup with careful deliberation, she stood, smoothing her skirts. "I must pay my respects," she murmured, but her purpose was far greater than mourning. As she approached Blackthorn House, the weight of 100 unseen eyes followed her. The village watched, their gazes slipping from behind lace curtains and dimly lit windows. The towering mansion loomed above her, its stone facade cold and unyielding, its leaded windows dark, like vacant eyes staring into the abyss. The iron gates creaked as she pushed them open, the air suddenly thick with something unspoken, something ancient and foreboding. Before she could knock, the door swung open, revealing Isabel Langley, Lord Blackthorn's secretary. Her usual composure was fractured, her slender fingers gripping the doorframe as though to steady herself. Her face, pale as wax, twitched with suppressed emotion. "Miss Graves," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. "Thank you for coming." Eleanor took in every detail, the way Isabel's hands trembled, the tightness in her jaw, the darting of her gaze. "A terrible loss," she said evenly. "You must have been one of the last to see him alive." Isabel hesitated, and for the briefest moment, something flickered in her eyes. Uncertainty, fear, guilt. "Yes," she admitted finally. "I left just before 9. He was as he always was. Distant, preoccupied, a pause, but alive." The air between them was charged with something unspoken. Isabel quickly excused herself, murmuring something about water for the bouquet Eleanor had brought. Left alone, Eleanor let her gaze wander. The study door loomed ahead, its deep mahogany surface gleaming under the dim hallway light. Her sharp eyes caught something others had missed, a faint scuff mark near the keyhole, an inconsistency in the otherwise pristine woodwork. She moved to the window, her fingers grazing the sill. A single damp leaf clung to the wood, an intruder from the outside world. Had it been carried in by the night breeze, or by an unseen hand? The heavy air was disturbed by the arrival of Victoria Blackthorne, the late Lord's widow. She was a woman of ice and steel, her grief a thing of careful calculation. Her presence filled the space with something sharper than sorrow, something dangerous. "Miss Graves," she greeted, her tone cool, detached. "How kind of you to call. My condolences, Lady Blackthorne," Eleanor said smoothly. "I imagine this is a difficult time." Victoria laughed, the sound hollow, brittle. "Difficult," she echoed. "My dear, you have no idea." The words hung between them, stretching the silence into something taut and waiting. Eleanor had seen grief take many forms: rage, despair, quiet resignation, but this was something else, something darker. The village of Ravenshade would whisper its own stories, conjure its own theories, but Eleanor Graves did not traffic in idle gossip. No, she sought the truth, the kind hidden in scuffed keyholes and misplaced leaves, in glances too fleeting to catch and silences too deliberate to ignore. And as she turned back toward the study, she knew with certainty this was only the beginning. Blackwood Manor stood against the morning mist like a spectre, its towering facade wrapped in ivy that clung like twisted veins to a dying heart. The weight of silence pressed upon its halls, as if the very stones whispered secrets too dark to bear the light. Within, the great drawing room lay in disarray, the heavy velvet drapes half drawn, casting slashes of shadow across the opulent furniture. A faint scent of cigar smoke still lingered, mingling with the sharper metallic bite of something more sinister. At the center of it all, slumped in his high-backed chair, was Lord Alistair Blackwood, his once commanding presence now reduced to a lifeless husk, his glass of brandy untouched beside him, his fingers frozen mid-motion over a scattering of letters. The locked door and untouched brandy were troubling details, but it was the expression frozen upon his face, eyes wide with something beyond fear, that sent a shudder down the spine of the housekeeper, Mrs. Pembroke. The first to arrive was Evelyn Harrington, an old family acquaintance, whose keen eyes missed nothing. She stepped into the dimly lit room, her gaze sweeping over the scene with the calculating precision of someone who understood that murder was rarely loud. It was silent, insidious, woven into the fabric of everyday life. "A locked room," she murmured, half to herself, as she touched the edge of the desk. A single sheet of paper bore an unfinished sentence, the ink still fresh enough to glisten in the candlelight. In the corridor, hushed voices intertwined like a tangle of invisible threads. Marcus Blackwood, the late Lord's nephew and primary heir, stood rigid, his dark eyes unreadable as he faced the others. "If you're suggesting I had anything to do with this," he bit out, his voice tight with barely restrained anger, "you're wasting your time. I stood to inherit either way." Evelyn's lips curved slightly, though her eyes remained unreadable. "It's never just about inheritance, Mr. Blackwood. Power is a peculiar thing. The mere promise of it can drive men to madness." The tension coiled between them was cut by the arrival of Beatrice Langley, the Lord's secretary, her complexion pale as if the house itself had leached the warmth from her skin. "He knew," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder as though afraid of unseen eyes lurking beyond the heavy shadows. "He knew something was coming. That's why he called in that detective, Arthur Redgrave." At the name, a ripple of unease passed through the gathered figures. Redgrave was no stranger to cases like these. Locked rooms whispered betrayals, murders wrapped in layers of deception, and as if summoned by the mere mention of his name, the grand doors creaked open, and he stepped inside, his presence cutting through the oppressive air like a blade. His sharp gaze flicked between the trembling secretary, the guarded air, and the calculating woman by the desk. "A man is dead," he said, his voice smooth yet firm, "and in a house like this, where every shadow hides a secret, I'd wager he's not the last." The weight of his words settled over them like a shroud. Somewhere within the manor, beyond the darkened corridors and the heavy velvet drapes, the truth lay buried, wrapped in half-finished letters, misplaced objects and glances too fleeting to catch. Evelyn turned back toward the desk, her fingers grazing the edge of the paper as her mind turned over the possibilities. Secrets festered in places like this, and as she cast one final glance toward the locked window, where a single damp leaf clung to the sill, she knew this was only the beginning. The heavy gloom of Blackwood Manor hung thick in the air, pressing against its mahogany-paneled walls like an unspoken curse. Inspector Caldwell, his uniform slightly rumpled from a restless night, stood in the grand drawing-room, where every tick of the ornate grandfather clock echoed like a whispered accusation. His eyes flickered across the gathered household, their faces a tableau of apprehension and carefully veiled secrets. The murder of Lord Blackwood was an enigma, a locked room, an untouched decanter of brandy, and a single, overturned chair that spoke of a struggle unseen. But it was not merely the mystery of his death that weighed upon them, it was the secrets he had taken to the grave, secrets that had begun to surface in uneasy glances and the quiet shifting of hands wringing at hems and cuffs. And then, with a presence as sharp as the morning frost, Victor Alden strode into the room. The private investigator, summoned under cryptic circumstances, carried an air of quiet confidence that sent a ripple of discomfort through the assembled guests. "Inspector Caldwell, I trust you won't mind if I lend my assistance," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something colder, something calculating. The inspector hesitated, a flicker of something close to relief passing over his face before he nodded. "Be my guest, Alden. This one's a riddle wrapped in shadows." Alden's gaze swept the room, taking in the details with the precision of a man who had spent too many years untangling lies from half-truths. His eyes lingered on the grand desk where Lord Blackwood had been found, his lifeless fingers curled around a fountain pen, as if he had been about to write something of significance. The paper before him was blank, save for a single ink blot, stark against the ivory parchment like a word that had never been spoken. Alden's lips pressed into a thin line. A man does not die mid-thought without leaving behind something, a whisper, a sign, a mistake. "Let's begin," he murmured, stepping forward, his presence drawing all eyes toward him. Marcus Blackwood, the late Lord's nephew, shifted uneasily. His inheritance was no secret, nor was his disdain for the suffocating influence his uncle had wielded over him. "If you're implying I had something to do with this," Marcus snapped before Alden could even pose a question, "you're wasting your time. I was at the club all evening." His voice was defensive, too quick, like a man aware of the knife's edge upon which he stood. Alden merely arched a brow. "An alibi is only as strong as the people willing to uphold it, Mr. Blackwood." Then there was Eleanor St. James, the poised and enigmatic governess, whose presence in the house had always been an enigma in itself. Her eyes were steady, but her fingers trembled as she adjusted the delicate lace at her wrist. Lord Blackwood had suspicions, she said carefully, as if weighing each word before releasing it. He believed someone in this house meant him harm. Alden's interest piqued. And did he confide in you, Miss St. James? Her hesitation was brief, but it was enough. He mentioned receiving letters, anonymous ones, threats. A low murmur swept through the room, but before anyone could speak, Alden turned his attention to the far end of the drawing room, where the housekeeper, Mrs. Pembroke, stood stiffly, her hands clasped in front of her as if in silent penance. "The safe," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the tense air like a knife. "It was locked when you found him." Her lips parted, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard. "Yes, sir, but the key, it's missing." Silence. A key, a safe. A man who had feared for his life, dead before he could reveal what haunted him. Inspector Caldwell exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "Damn it all, Alden, what are you getting at?" Alden turned, his gaze sweeping once more across the room, where every face was a mask, every breath a concealed motive. "I'm getting at the fact that this wasn't a simple murder, Inspector. This was a warning, and until we find out what Lord Blackwood knew, we have no idea just how deep this goes." Somewhere beyond the heavy curtains and the towering bookshelves, the manor exhaled, its secrets shifting in the silence, waiting for the right hand to pull the thread that would unravel them all. The heavy air of Ravenscroft Manor clung like an unseen presence, thick with the weight of old money and older secrets. Inspector Harrow, his coat still damp from the evening mist, cast a sharp glance around the gathered household, his tired eyes betraying a sleepless night spent poring over a crime scene that made less sense the longer he studied it. The death of Lord Everley had been sudden, found slumped over his study desk, a glass of untouched port at his side, his fingers curled as if they had been reaching for something that never came. No sign of forced entry, no struggle, yet something was amiss. He had been expecting answers, but instead all he found were whispers, shadows that refused to take shape. The arrival of Dorian Graves, a private investigator of quiet reputation yet undeniable presence, shifted the mood. His movements were measured, deliberate, as if he already knew where the loose threads of the mystery lay. "Inspector, I understand Lord Everley had concerns before his passing." Graves inquired, his voice smooth, deceptively calm. Harrow hesitated, then nodded. He believed someone was watching him, left vague reports with his solicitor, but nothing concrete. Graves' gaze swept the room, his attention drawn not just to the people within it, but to the house itself, the towering bookshelves, the heavy velvet drapes, the faint scent of cigars mixed with something sharper. He approached the desk, fingers grazing its polished surface before his eyes landed on the clock atop the mantel. "The time," he murmured, adjusting his cufflinks absent-mindedly. "It's incorrect." A simple observation, but one that sent an unspoken current through the room. Someone had altered it. Across from him, Vincent Everley, the deceased's nephew and sole heir, shifted slightly. "It must have stopped in the night," he said too quickly, too dismissively. Graves turned to him with a polite smile. "Perhaps. Or perhaps someone wanted us to believe the crime occurred at a different hour." Lady Eleanor, Lord Everley's widow, perched on the edge of a chaise, her delicate hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. "It's all quite unsettling," she murmured, her voice carefully composed. "My husband was not a man prone to paranoia." Graves nodded, studying her with keen interest. Yet he was unsettled enough to alter his routine. Was he not? A man accustomed to habit doesn't begin locking his study door at night without cause. His words hung between them, unchallenged. Near the fireplace, the housekeeper, Mrs. Kane, stood with the rigid poise of a woman accustomed to keeping her own secrets. "Lord Everley was particular," she said carefully, avoiding direct eye contact. "But he trusted those under his roof." "Trust," Graves repeated softly, as if tasting the word. A rare commodity in a house where the safe was found open. Silence, a shifting of weight, a collective intake of breath. The safe was locked, Vincent corrected, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Graves glanced at Harrow, who hesitated before clearing his throat. When I arrived it was, but, he stopped, realizing too late what he had admitted. The body had been discovered, the study door locked from within, and yet someone had tampered with the safe before the scene had been officially examined. Graves turned back to the room, his expression unreadable. Then the question remains, who had access before the police? Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her handkerchief. Vincent's jaw tightened, the housekeeper's eyes darted to the floor. All small things, but to Graves, they spoke volumes. Later, after the household had dispersed, and the inspector busied himself with reports, Graves found himself lingering near the study, fingers tracing the edge of the port glass, left untouched. He lifted it slightly, inhaling, faint, almost imperceptible, but there, a scent that did not belong to Lord Everley, an expensive cologne, one Graves recognized. Outside, the wind howled against the stained glass windows of Ravenscroft Manor, as if the house itself longed to speak its secrets aloud. But it did not need to. The truth was already unraveling, thread by thread, and Graves knew someone within these walls was about to slip. The air in Blackwood Hollow carried a weight of something unspoken, thick with the quiet hum of secrets waiting to be unearthed. Eleanor Wren, with her unassuming presence and sharp, watchful eyes, moved through the village as though she belonged to its very bones. Her method was never in grand proclamations, but in the slow accumulation of knowledge, each interaction a thread in the tapestry of a mystery only she could see taking shape. Today the village bakery was her chosen stage, the scent of warm bread mingling with the crisp bite of autumn. Across the counter, Agnes Holloway, the baker's wife, kneaded dough with a vigor that betrayed an anxious mind. "Strange times, Miss Wren," she murmured, eyes darting towards the street where the constable's bicycle leaned against the post. What with Mr. Cartwright's sudden passing and all, Eleanor merely offered a knowing smile, her hands folding over the small parcel of scones she hadn't yet paid for. "And why do you say strange, Mrs. Holloway? Tragedy, surely, but strange." Agnes hesitated, her fingers gripping the dough a fraction tighter. Only that he weren't the sort to leave things undone, yet his account book was left open. Half a note scribbled and abandoned, not like him at all, a pause, a calculated shift in tone, and poor Miss Lillian, imagine being the one to find him. Eleanor's grip on her parcel firmed, though her face betrayed no such intrigue. "Yes," she mused, stepping aside as another patron entered. "I imagine she must be quite shaken." But it was not Lillian's grief that lingered in her mind as she left the bakery. It was the unfinished note, the ghost of words never spoken. At the Hollow's modest tea-house, she settled by the window, the village's heartbeat unfolding before her. Lillian, dressed in mourning black, walked past, her gloved hands clenched too tightly, her gaze fixed ahead, as if afraid to meet the whispers trailing in her wake. The constable followed not far behind, his brow furrowed in quiet contemplation. Eleanor took a measured sip of her tea. The puzzle was shifting, and she could feel the weight of the missing pieces beginning to slide into place. Later, at the late Mr. Cartwright's residence, where the air still held the ghost of pipe smoke and old books, Eleanor let her gloved fingers trail over the desk's polished surface. The ink pot remained uncapped, the quill resting at an odd angle beside the half-written note. She didn't need to read it to know. Someone had been here before her. The fine layer of dust on the bookshelf, the one missing volume, subtle signs, but signs nonetheless. Near the fireplace, the faint scent of something floral, expensive and decidedly out of place lingered in the air. Eleanor tilted her head, inhaling softly. It was the same cologne she had caught in passing outside the tea-house, on the constable's coat. The evening fog rolled in as she stepped out, the cobblestone streets now slick with moisture. Blackwood Hollow, with its quiet corners and carefully tended gardens, had always been a place of order. But order, as Eleanor well knew, was often the perfect disguise for chaos. As she walked back to her cottage, the village around her hummed with the illusion of peace, yet she saw it for what it truly was, an intricate web, each strand carefully woven, waiting only for the right touch to unravel. The air in Ashcombe Hollow carried the scent of damper earth and something less tangible, a whisper of old grievances left to fester in the silence of time. Eleanor Whitmore, with her unassuming grace and needlepoint curiosity, moved through the village with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that truth rarely shouted, it whispered, waiting for the right ear to listen. She had spent the morning at the milliner's, the afternoon at the post office, gathering more than idle chatter, and now as dusk settled over the ivy-clad walls of Everleigh Manor, she found herself seated opposite its mistress, Beatrice Everleigh, a woman whose sorrow clung to her like a veil of lace. "Not all things that break are meant to be mended," Beatrice murmured, her voice lined with the weight of memories that refused to rest. Eleanor's gaze drifted to a photograph upon the mantel, a younger Charles Everleigh, his arm around another man, their likeness uncanny, their bond frozen in time. And this man beside him. Eleanor's tone was soft, but there was an undeniable current beneath it. Beatrice's fingers curled over the armrest of her chair, her nails pressing into the fabric. "Richard," she admitted after a long pause, the name tasting bitter on her tongue. "His cousin, they were inseparable once. Then everything went sour." "Sour?" Eleanor prompted, setting aside her teacup with deliberate patience. The room seemed to shrink as Beatrice exhaled, the firelight casting flickering shadows against the wallpaper. Charles was involved in dealings, not entirely legal. It was hushed up, but the damage was done. Richard was one of the many left with nothing. He left Ashcombe Hollow after that. I never saw him again. Eleanor's fingers tapped against the arm of her chair. And yet I have reason to believe he returned, under another name perhaps. Beatrice's expression shifted, the veneer of detachment cracking just enough to let something raw glisten beneath. "Penrose," she whispered. "He reminds me of Richard, now that you mention it." Eleanor absorbed this in silence, her mind threading the connection into the growing web of intrigue. The past rarely stays buried in places like this. "Mrs. Everleigh," she said, her voice almost amused, though her eyes held only gravity. "It has a way of slipping back in, whether we welcome it or not." By the time she left Everleigh Manor, the night had swallowed the last vestiges of daylight, leaving only the distant glow of the village lanterns to punctuate the dark. The vicarage, a modest but proud residence, stood at the heart of the village, its garden overgrown but not neglected, the scent of lavender lingering in the cool air. Reverend Alistair Hale greeted her with a solemn nod, his brow furrowed in thought before she had even spoken. "Charles Everleigh came to see me some weeks before he died," he admitted over the rim of his untouched tea. "He spoke of absolution, Miss Whitmore. A man like that, seeking forgiveness, it was most unusual." "Perhaps he felt the noose tightening," Eleanor suggested, her tone light but her meaning anything but. The vicar considered this, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, or perhaps he knew that the sins of the past have a way of demanding payment. Eleanor merely inclined her head, allowing his words to settle into the growing puzzle in her mind. The evening led her to the Fox and Hound, the village's favoured public house, where secrets were traded more freely than coin. She settled into a quiet corner, her presence unremarkable to those too preoccupied with their own murmurings. Thomas Whitby, the barkeep, sidled over with a knowing look, wiping his hands on his apron before leaning in. "You're sniffing around Everleigh's business, aren't you?" "Sniffing is such an ungraceful term, Mr. Whitby," Eleanor replied, arching a delicate brow. "Observing, perhaps." He smirked but dropped his voice lower. "Then you might be interested to know that Penrose, if that's even his real name, was here before all this trouble began. Checked in under the name Cartwright, kept to himself mostly, except for when he wasn't. And when he wasn't, he had long talks with Everleigh, late at night. Tense, those meetings, like two men trying to settle an old score." Eleanor's smile was slight but satisfied. "How very telling," she murmured. As the night deepened, and the village slept, Eleanor sat in the solitude of her study, the dim light of her oil lamp casting elongated shadows across the walls. The pieces were aligning, the whispers of the past converging upon the present in ways only she could see. Ashcombe Hollow, with its quaint charm and well-kept facades, was no stranger to secrets, but secrets, like ghosts, had a way of demanding to be seen. And Eleanor Whitmore had always been one to see them first. The village of Blackwood Hollow wore the night like a shroud, its cobbled streets glistening under the pale moonlight, whispering with the weight of untold stories. Eleanor Whitmore, ever the quiet observer of human nature, stepped lightly through the evening hush, her shawl pulled close against the crisp autumn air. The warmth of the Black Hart Inn called to her like a beacon, its low beams and dim lanterns casting long shadows over men nursing their ales and women exchanging hushed gossip. Thomas Harrow, the innkeeper, inclined his head as she approached. "Miss Whitmore, you don't often grace us at this hour." "Curiosity is a restless companion, Mr. Harrow," she mused, her eyes sweeping the room, noting the absence of one Arthur Gresham, a man who had appeared in Blackwood Hollow mere weeks before tragedy struck the Everley estate. "Tell me, did our Mr. Gresham frequent this establishment?" Harrow's gaze flickered, his fingers tightening around the damp cloth he was wringing. "That one, kept to himself mostly, except when he didn't." Eleanor smiled, the kind of smile that invited secrets to slip free. "And when he didn't, had words with Charles Everley, more than once. Late at night, when most decent folk were in bed. His voice dropped. He stayed here under the name Cartwright, you know. But I never trusted a man who changes his name as easily as his coat." Eleanor absorbed this, tucking it into the ever-expanding tapestry of intrigue unfolding around her. As she left the inn, the village seemed to watch her, its very walls thick with the weight of secrets waiting to be exhumed. She turned toward the vicarage, where Reverend Hale received her with his usual measured calm. "Charles Everley came to me not long ago," he admitted over a half-drunk cup of tea, "spoke of wanting peace." "Peace?" Eleanor echoed, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her own cup, "for himself or another." Hale's eyes darkened. "That, I cannot say. But the look in his eyes, Miss Whitmore, it was the look of a man who feared his past was finally knocking at his door." She nodded, thoughtful, as the pieces aligned further. By the time she arrived at Everley Manor, the house loomed before her like a silent sentinel, its windows dark save for the faintest glow from within. The air smelled of damp earth and dying leaves, and the hush of the night seemed thicker here, as though the house itself was reluctant to speak of what it knew. Eleanor approached the heavy oak door, lifting the brass knocker with deliberate slowness. A moment later, Beatrice Everley answered, her night robe drawn tightly around her frame. "Miss Whitmore," she breathed, weariness clinging to every syllable, "this is hardly a time for social calls. I find that the truth prefers the night, Mrs. Everley." Eleanor replied, "And I believe the past has finally come home to roost." The flicker in Beatrice's eyes was all the confirmation she needed. In Blackwood Hollow, where every whisper carried the weight of history, the truth had a way of finding its way back to the surface, no matter how deeply one tried to bury it. Beneath the weight of a moonless night, where the ancient oaks of Ashworth village murmured secrets to the wind, Eleanor Graves stepped onto the gravel path leading to Blackthorn Hall. The manor loomed ahead, its ivy-clad stone walls swallowing the dim glow of her lantern, its towering silhouette a relic of bygone sins. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, the kind that clung to old houses where the past refused to stay buried. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, a lonely haunting sound that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. As she neared the entrance, a faint creak broke the silence, the whisper of the house exhaling after centuries of holding its breath. She adjusted her gloves, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the brass handle of the grand oak door. Inside, the hall stretched before her, a cavern of shadows where every step sent echoes spiraling into the depths of the house. The chandeliers overhead had long since gone dark, their crystals trembling slightly as if acknowledging her arrival. The air carried the scent of aged mahogany, smouldering embers, and something else, something faintly metallic, almost like blood. Then a flicker of movement, a shadow at the far end of the corridor, just beyond the massive oak staircase. Eleanor froze. A trick of the light, or something more tangible. Her heartbeat quickened, but she willed herself to remain composed. She had come under the pretense of returning a book, a rare volume on Victorian poisons lent to her by Lord Ainsworth before his sudden and some whispered, unnatural demise. But her true purpose was far graver. The study, she needed to see it for herself, the room where Ainsworth had met his end, slumped over his desk, his untouched glass of port still glistening under the gaslight. The door had been locked since the night of the tragedy, sealed away like a tomb, but Eleanor knew that locks were meant to be opened, and secrets were meant to be unearthed. A voice cut through the stillness. Miss Graves, prowling the halls at such an hour. The words were smooth, but beneath them lurked something sharp, something calculating. Eleanor turned to find Jonathan Whitmore leaning against the banister, his silhouette framed by the dim glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. His posture was casual, yet there was an undeniable tension in the way his fingers curled around the railing. His presence was no accident. "Returning a book, Mr. Whitmore. But I seem to have lost my way." Her voice was calm, betraying none of the unease curling in her stomach. Whitmore stepped closer, his smile practiced but devoid of warmth. "How fortunate then that I found you before you stumbled upon anything unintended." A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken implications. The flickering candlelight cast shifting shadows across his face, his expression unreadable. Eleanor lifted her chin slightly, a quiet defiance in her gaze. "And yet, Mr. Whitmore, it is often the unintended discoveries that prove the most illuminating." His expression faltered, if only for a second before he recovered, his eyes darkening. "Curiosity can be perilous in these matters, Miss Graves." She let a small smile touch her lips. "So can deception." His jaw tightened. "Take care not to tread where the ground is less than steady." And with that he turned and disappeared into the corridor. Eleanor exhaled slowly. If she had harbored any doubts before, they were now dispelled. Jonathan Whitmore knew more than he let on, and his warning was not one of concern, but of caution. The question was, what was he trying to hide? She turned back to the study door, her fingers grazing the brass handle. The lock was simple, a relic of a time when trust had been more abundant than suspicion. A few deft movements with the pick she carried, and the door yielded with a soft click. The room was frozen in time, papers lay undisturbed, the heavy scent of cigar smoke still lingering in the air. But it was the desk that drew her forward, the very place where Lord Ainsworth had last sat. Her eyes moved over its surface, noting the faint circular mark left behind by a glass, the same glass of port he had never touched. Carefully, she reached for the decanter nearby, its deep ruby liquid catching the candlelight. But something was wrong, the way the liquid clung to the crystal, the almost imperceptible change in viscosity. It was subtle, but to an observant eye, unmistakable. Poison. A soft gust of wind whispered through the room, teasing the candle flames in their sconces. Eleanor stiffened. She was not alone. The certainty pressed against her ribs, cool and insistent. Someone had been watching her, waiting, hidden in the silent corners of Blackthorn Hall. She had lingered too long. Carefully, she stepped back, easing the door shut behind her. The manor, with its centuries-old grandeur, now felt less like a house and more like a waiting mouth, ready to swallow secrets whole. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the book she still carried. The truth was a puzzle, its pieces scattered, but she had found one tonight, a small damning piece that whispered of premeditated murder. She only had to live long enough to assemble the rest. The grand halls of Ravenshade Manor stood steeped in centuries of secrets, their towering chandeliers casting fractured light upon the dark, polished floors. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment, burning embers, and something more elusive, a whisper of decay that clung to the tapestries, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the sins of their past. Jonathan Blackwood's posture stiffened, his charm momentarily faltering as his gaze darkened. "I assure you," he said, his voice edged with the slightest tremor, "my only intention is to uncover the truth." But Evelyn Harrow, ever the keen observer, tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "The truth," she mused, her tone deceptively mild, "or a personal vendetta cloaked in the guise of justice?" Blackwood's fingers curled against the mahogany desk, the tension in his stance betraying him. "You think you know everything, don't you?" His voice rose, his carefully cultivated demeanor unraveling. "But you don't understand what's at stake. Hollister took everything from me, my name, my future, my family's legacy." The room, with its vaulted ceilings and grandiose decor, suddenly seemed smaller, the air heavier, as if the walls had drawn closer to bear witness to the confrontation. Inspector Graves, once skeptical, now stood with quiet authority, bolstered by Evelyn's incisive deductions. She watched, her mind weaving together the puzzle, noting that in a place like Ravenshade, where the past was a ghost in every corridor, it was always the outsider's secrets that proved the most dangerous. Blackwood's mask had cracked, his intentions laid bare, but the final piece was yet to be found. Moving to the late Hollister's study, where dust still settled over half-written letters and the scent of cigar smoke lingered like a fading spectre, Evelyn's fingers brushed against a stack of yellowed documents. Beneath them, something caught her eye, a torn fragment of a letter, its edges jagged, its ink slightly smudged. But one name stood stark against the aged paper: Nicholas Hawthorne. A flicker of understanding crossed her mind, and without hesitation, she turned on her heel, seeking out the only man who could confirm what she suspected. Reverend Whitmore sat amidst his endless rows of books, the dim candlelight flickering over the lines of wisdom etched into his face. "Do you know this name?" Evelyn inquired, holding out the fragment. The Reverend's gaze fell upon the paper, and something in his expression shifted, recognition, perhaps even regret. "Nicholas Hawthorne," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of old wounds. "Yes, he was a man who lost everything to Hollister's schemes long ago, left in disgrace. Some say he vowed never to return, but he had returned, not as a victim, but as an executioner." Evelyn's breath caught as the realization settled in. Jonathan Blackwood was Nicholas Hawthorne. He had donned a new identity, played the role of investigator, infiltrated Hollister's life under the guise of seeking justice, all the while orchestrating a far more personal revenge. The truth, now uncovered, demanded confrontation. Back in the grand study, Blackwood Hawthorne stood rigid, his back to the desk where Hollister had once held dominion. "You thought," Evelyn said softly, her voice sharp as a blade, "that you could step into this house, weave your web of deception, and exact revenge under a different name. That no one would recognize the cracks in your performance." His eyes flashed, his hands curling into fists. "He deserved it," Hawthorne breathed, his voice raw with fury. "He destroyed me, destroyed everything I loved. I used what he taught me, deception, misdirection. I became the very thing he was, just long enough to make him pay." The room, once a symbol of power, now felt like a stage set for his downfall, its grandeur reduced to nothing more than a silent audience to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Evelyn Harrow, with her unassuming wit and sharp mind, had unmasked the illusion, stripping away Hawthorne's disguise like the final layer of a long-buried secret. Here in Ravenshade Manor, where truth and lies had danced a delicate waltz, the past had come full circle. But vengeance, she knew, had never been the path to peace, only to ruin. The heavy silence of Ashcroft Manor was broken only by the frantic footsteps echoing through its grand corridors. Nathaniel Drake, his once impeccable composure shattered, rushed past the gilded mirrors and looming oil portraits, his breath ragged, his carefully woven deception unraveling with each desperate stride. The walls, lined with tapestries whispering of past grandeur, seemed to close in, suffocating him under the weight of his exposed sins. Outside, the village lay under the dim glow of gas lamps, its cobbled streets slick with the evening mist, its centuries-old buildings standing like silent judges to the unfolding drama. Drake had only one thought: escape. He darted toward the train station, the old iron clock tower looming above, its minute hand inching toward his dwindling freedom. But waiting for him at the ticket counter, knitting needles clicking rhythmically in her hands, was Eleanor Hargrove. She did not look up as he stumbled to a halt, his face a mask of disbelief and dread. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood," she greeted, her tone as smooth and unshaken as ever. "I had a feeling you might take the direct route." His name, his true name, struck like a blow. He had spent years concealing it, erasing his past, crafting a new identity. But now, it lay bare before her, dissected with the precision of a scalpel. Drake Blackwood glanced around, searching for a gap in the encroaching noose. But the game had already ended. The rhythmic stomp of boots on the wooden platform signaled the arrival of Inspector Caldwell and his officers, their expressions grim with the weight of justice about to be served. "Nathaniel Blackwood," the inspector declared, his voice echoing through the station, "you are under arrest for the murder of Alistair Grimshaw." The train's whistle screamed through the fog, but it was not his salvation, it was his requiem. The villagers, drawn by the commotion, gathered in hushed clusters, their faces a mixture of relief and muted satisfaction. Some whispered of poetic justice, others of the inevitability of fate. As Blackwood was led away, his shoulders slumped in resignation, Eleanor observed in quiet contemplation. Her hands stilled, the knitting needles finally at rest. "It's always the ones in a hurry," she murmured to herself, "while those of us with patience have all the time in the world." The drama had reached its crescendo, the village's peace momentarily restored, but in places like Ashcroft, shadows never lingered far, and Eleanor Hargrove, with her unassuming air and sharp mind, knew better than anyone that secrets, like crimes, never stayed buried for long. The air inside Blackthorn Manor was thick with the weight of revelation, the grand drawing room now a courtroom where truth took the stand. The fire in the marble hearth flickered, casting elongated shadows against the somber faces of those gathered, each suspect caught in the intricate web of deception that had bound them all to the crime. At the center, Eleanor Winslow, her knitting needles now still, surveyed the room with the keen eye of one who had already unraveled every lie. Across from her stood Victor Langley, once a trusted confidant, now a man stripped of pretense, his polished veneer cracking under the cold certainty of his downfall. "It was always going to end this way, wasn't it, Miss Winslow?" he said, his voice carrying the brittle edge of resignation. "Indeed," Eleanor replied, the corners of her lips curling in the faintest ghost of a smile. "The moment you tried to rewrite time, you ensured its betrayal." A hush fell as she turned to the others, her voice calm but unyielding. "The illusion of an impossible crime, you see, is only as strong as its weakest detail." The grandfather clock in the study, shifted ever so slightly to manipulate the time of death, was your downfall, Mr. Langley. A gasp escaped Margaret Ashford, her gloved hand flying to her mouth. "The clock?" she whispered, her mind racing back to the moment she had glanced at its gilded face. Its hands just barely misaligned. "A clever ruse," Eleanor continued, "but not clever enough. Just as Miss Havisham's key, which she believed misplaced, was used to lock the door from the outside, creating the illusion of an impossible crime. And yet, even the best-laid plans crumble under scrutiny." Langley exhaled sharply, his mask slipping further. "And what of motive?" he challenged, though the defeat in his eyes betrayed the bravado in his voice. Eleanor's gaze did not waver. "Greed, Mr. Langley, the inheritance you so desperately sought to secure. But in orchestrating the perfect murder, you overlooked one crucial thing. Time has its own way of bearing witness." Silence thickened as the weight of her words settled over the room. Inspector Caldwell, who had stood quietly until now, stepped forward, his presence an unspoken finality. "Victor Langley," he announced, his voice steady, "you are under arrest for the murder of Alistair Wren." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Langley let out a slow, bitter chuckle. "Checkmate, Miss Winslow," he murmured, his fate now sealed. The manor, which had for so long housed secrets, exhaled with the truth now laid bare. Outside, the village of Ravenswood stirred, the hushed murmurs of scandal already weaving into legend. But Eleanor Winslow, with her steady hands and sharper mind, merely picked up her knitting once more, casting one last glance at the faces around her. "It's always the impatient ones who fall," she mused, resuming the quiet rhythm of her needles, "while those of us who wait have all the time in the world." The storm had long passed, but its echoes still lingered within the grand walls of Ashworth Manor, where secrets had been buried deeper than the foundation itself. Eleanor Blackwood, her silhouette stark against the fading twilight, stood at the threshold, her decision made. The past had anchored her for too long, and with each step away from the manor, she shed the weight of betrayal, seeking solace in a world untouched by the treacheries she had witnessed. From the garden terrace, Judith Winfield watched in contemplative silence, her hands deftly working at her embroidery, though her mind remained elsewhere. She had long understood that justice was not just the blade of the law, but the quiet consequences that settled into the bones of those left behind. In Ravenshire, where every whispered rumor was another stitch in the town's tapestry, the closing of one story only meant the opening of another, one that inevitably she would find herself entangled in. The village, once suffocated under the weight of intrigue, seemed to inhale once more, its streets no longer haunted by the ghosts of deception. Yet beneath the polished veneer of normalcy, under the thatched roofs and behind lace-curtained windows, the unspoken truths still festered. The drawing rooms once thick with accusations and confessions now hummed with a different kind of energy, the townsfolk resuming their daily lives with an unshaken pretense of peace, though the shadows of what had transpired would linger in hushed conversations over morning tea. Judith's gaze drifted beyond the garden, toward the village square, where lanterns flickered against the encroaching night. In Mrs. Pembroke's sitting room, the scent of bergamot and old parchment mingled as the evening's gossip unfolded with animated fervor. "You must tell me, Judith, how did you unravel it all?" Mrs. Pembroke's voice carried a breathless curiosity, as she poured another round of tea, her fingers still trembling from the excitement of the revelations. Judith accepted the cup with a faint smile, the ghost of amusement flickering in her eyes. "It is simply a matter of observation, my dear. Patterns repeat themselves, human nature rarely deviates, and where others see mere coincidences, I see the inevitable." Mrs. Pembroke shuddered, shaking her head with a mix of admiration and disbelief. "It's positively uncanny how you see through it all." Judith took a measured sip, allowing the warmth to settle in her chest before replying. "We are all creatures of habit, even in deceit. The trick is to watch, to listen, and to wait." As the evening waned, and the teacups were set aside, Judith walked homeward, the cool breeze whispering through the ancient oaks lining the path. Inside the quiet sanctuary of her study, the fire crackled, its embers mirroring the thoughts that danced behind her sharp eyes. Her hands resumed their familiar work, each stitch a silent meditation, each thread a quiet reassurance that the world, no matter how dark, could always be mended. And as the village of Ravenshire settled into the illusion of peace once more, she knew it was only a matter of time before the next secret surfaced, before the next crime disturbed the delicate balance. With a final glance toward the moonlit window, Judith Winfield allowed herself a small knowing smile. Darkness was never far behind, but neither was she.